Los Angeles. And it's a big affair. The chariots are 4 stories high. There's 3 of them. They're built by our devotees. And our chariots they have a brake system on them and a steering system on them, and that they have a retractable canopy, so the canopy folds down. You can see the chariots parked. We have a big parking lot at the LA Temple. The LA Temple is a huge complex. It's about half a block, both sides of the street. And right on Venice Boulevard, there's a huge parking lot. And in that parking lot, the chariots rest for, they sit there for the whole year to wait to be used. And the modern day chariots were built by a devotee named Ratha Yatra. And he uses the chassis of a car as as part of the framework, and then has a whole brake system and a steering system. It's a whole thing. He also has a traveling chariot that he has built that fits into what do I want to say? A trailer. Whatever, 12-foot trailer that then you can attach to a vehicle, a truck. I think it probably is a truck with a third axle, a dually truck with a third axle, and like a big truck. And then they can drive that chariot anywhere in the world or anywhere in the country, and then they can set up a Ratha Yatra immediately anywhere in the country. So we have in our temples, we have maybe 70 temples in the U.S. or something like that. In our temples, we have a tradition around Ratha Yatra. So the first carts were built by a devotee named Jayananda, who passed away from cancer in the mid-70s. And he was very young. He was in his early 30s. But he had joined the Hare Krishna movement as a young man. He was a little bit older than all the other devotees, so he was in his mid-late 20s when he became a devotee, as opposed to being in his late teens, early 20s. So he was maybe 5-7 years older than all the other devotees. And he was a taxi driver at one point, and was in general, he was a handy person, a little bit of a carpenter, a little bit of a machinist. And he worked tirelessly to build the first Ratha Yatra carts for our temples. And there's a famous story that he was falling asleep in Srila Prabhupada's class. He'd worked all night. And there's a whole history. When I joined the Hare Krishna movement, the first thing I did when I joined as a brahmachari was I flew to New York and I set up the Ratha Yatra and joined a devotee whose name is Madhuha. And Madhuha is, for the last 40 years, every year, he has a semi-truck, a full-sized, there's a 52-foot semi-truck, like an actual full-blown semi-truck. And that has within it an entire festival, tents and a stage, a whole festival. The festival up in LA that we set up at Venice Beach, Madhuha drives from North Carolina, where he lives. He travels all over the US and Canada every year for about 3 months. And it's all volunteer labor, and it's young men. So I was 18 and I joined his traveling festival. Young men, and also some Vaishnav youth, even 18, but even like 15, 16 years old. There's a whole group of young men that join him, and they travel all over the country and they set up Ratha Yatra festivals. And so I went to New York, and I got to New York at maybe midnight, and then I slept in they had a large bus that they'd removed everything from the bus, a school bus, and they'd removed everything from the school bus. It was just the floor. So I slept in there, and then the next morning we got up, and they shaved my head. They put me to work in the kitchen for about 12 hours washing pots, like an endless sea of pots, because they were cooking for thousands of devotees who come to New York for the festival. And it was, blazing hot in the middle of June in New York. The second weekend in June was when they celebrated, just the worst weather ever. But then, simultaneously they had no hot water going on, so it was like cold water showers, but in the middle of June, so you're hot all day. And then also in a basement. The kitchen was in a basement with no windows, no lights. New York has basements, unlike unlike California, where we have earthquakes. There's no basements. If you go to the Midwest, you go to the East Coast, every house has a basement attached to it. But in the basements in India, it's cooler. You dig the basements into the ground, and the coolness of the ground creates maybe 10, 20 degrees cooler underneath the house. But somehow, I don't know why, but the way New York is constructed, the basement is hotter than ground floor. Somehow it gets hotter. I don't know why, but maybe the earth isn't right there, so you don't feel the coolness of the earth. And so it was sweltering. And then after washing pots all day, then they shaved my head. My shoes had become ruined just because I was standing in water, maybe up to my mid-calf the whole day from the pots, and so my shoes disintegrated. So I had to walk around New York barefoot looking for a new pair of shoes to wear, a new pair of sandals to wear. And then that night, we all went out to Washington Square Park, which is it wasn't like the nicest park in the world. And especially at night, the night in Washington Park was a little fierce. It was a little dangerous. But there was a crew of us that went out and we worked the whole night. The whole night. So from, maybe 10 o'clock at night to 5 o'clock in the morning for 7 hours, and maybe it was 30 of us. And we set up a huge festival overnight, because you get permission from the city. You have to set up overnight, do the festival in one day, and then break it down. So then we went back to the temple, took a bath, and then they asked me to drive a flatbed truck in the festival. So there was a group of kirtaniyas who come from Bengal. Krishna Kirtan was his name, and Nityananda Pran was the mridanga player. So it was a mridanga player and a harmonium player together. Krishna Kirtan and Nityananda Pran. And they sat on the back, maybe about 15 kirtaniyas from Bengal who've been doing kirtan, our style of kirtan, Vaishnava, Padavali kirtan, Nam kirtan their whole life. And they were incredibly expert. And they did kirtan on Fifth Avenue. Our parade goes down Fifth Avenue in New York City, in Manhattan. In some ways, you could say the most important city in the world. And then at the end of that, there's a huge festival. And so I drove the truck the whole festival, so it was maybe 5-6 hours. And then we had to break down the festival that same night. So around 6 p.m., 7 p.m., we broke down the festival. And then we jumped in vehicles and we drove to Chicago, which it's got to be 12 hours or something like that. It's a long drive. And we drove overnight because we had to set up in Chicago the next day. And so it was this incredible austerity, this incredible yajna, this big, act of, just day after day of service and very simple living and really, pushing yourself to the limit of what's humanly possible in terms of sleep deprivation and physical labor. So there's a whole history in America of the Ratha Yatra. And there's a group of devotees from the beginning. And the first devotee to build Ratha Yatra carts, his name was Jayananda. And he passed away. I think he had leukemia. If I'm not mistaken, he had leukemia. And he passed away from leukemia. And I believe it was 1975. Could have been 1976. I think it was 75. And his picture is on every Ratha Yatra cart in the U.S. So they have a Ratha Yatra cart and they'll have Jayananda's picture there on the cart in honor of the fact that he built the first Ratha Yatra cart. And then Donald Trump, the actual Donald Trump Jr., he had purchased the railroads, like somehow the railroad storage properties in New York City. So there's a railroad that goes through Manhattan. And he'd purchased those buildings alongside the railroad. And it was the only place big enough to store our carts in New York City, close to Fifth Avenue. And so we approached Donald Trump. This was in 1975. He was a young man at that time. He was in his probably early 20s. And maybe early 30s, something like that, whatever it was. He's in his late 70s now, so you figure it out, 1975, 48 years later. And so late 20s. He was in his late 20s. And he gave us permission. And so our carts for several years were stored, and he didn't charge us any money for it. So we think maybe that's how he became the president, because he did a little service for the devotees, and so despite maybe so many other disqualifications, somehow or other, he did a little seva and ended up working out for him. So there's a whole history. And Jayananda came to Prabhupada's class after setting up the carts all night, but he was exhausted, so he was falling asleep in Prabhupada's class, and devotees started to nudge him to wake him up. And Prabhupada got angry. He was lecturing, got angry at the devotees for waking him up. And he chastised them and said, "You let him sleep. He does more than all of you." And so there's a famous story where Prabhupada expressed his affection to Jayananda by allowing him to just sleep in his class. And but in addition to so we have our history, and our history starts with Jayananda, whose pictures on all the carts, who gave Prabhupada a donation to print. I'm forgetting which book. It might be the Chaitanya Charitamrita. He gave him a donation. He got some kind of settlement because he had leukemia and it was terminal, so his insurance gave him some kind of settlement, and he gave that money to Prabhupada to print one of our first edition books. Like George Harrison gave Prabhupada a donation to print the first Krishna book from the Beatles. So this Jayananda gave a donation to print one of our books. I can't remember which one it was. And so, we have a history. And so his picture's on our cart, we remember him, and then following in his footsteps, we have this devotee Madhuha, who for 40 years now has been traveling all over the U.S. for 3 months a year. He's in his 70s now. He's an old man now. He was, when I first met him, he was in his 30s. And now he's in his late 30s. Now he's in his 70s. And he's getting to the end of his life, but he always has a group of young, strong people who serve him and help him set up these huge festivals, like the festival we just set up at the Venice Boardwalk. And I was part of that group when I was 18, and then my son became part of his group when he was 15, 16. So it's a generational thing now. So my sons have gone and traveled with Madhuha to set up festivals, just like I traveled with Madhuha when I was a young man. And then I'm pretty sure my sons' will do the same thing. And then we have, so that's one arc, that's one trajectory. But then coming from Jayananda, there's another trajectory. And that is, there's this devotee named Ratha Bhushan, who I've known for 35 years, who's also now in his late 60s. And he built the Ratha Yatra carts in Los Angeles. And it's not like there's a manual on how to build a festival chariot. So he had to figure it out, take apart cars, brake systems, and figure out how to build a vehicle that has steering on it and a brake system that could be operated on the road, because we take over Abbot Kinney, which is like Main Street between Santa Monica and Venice. It's the biggest street between. I guess Lincoln is bigger, but it's really the heart of both Santa Monica as well as Main Street. In fact, our festival starts at the Santa Monica Civic Center. It's literally next to City Hall. in Santa Monica, and then it goes all the way down to the Venice Boardwalk, which is the heart of Venice. And we're on, and the police are out. It's a full-blown parade. And so he built those carts. And those carts, they have a retractable canopy, which is the ceiling, and they drive them, they tow them there, and somebody sits on the cart and drives it behind the vehicle that tows it. So it's a whole thing. And so I thought what we would discuss today is we would discuss the tradition in Jagannath Puri. So we have a tradition in the U.S. starting from Jayananda and then branching off to Madhuha with his semi-truck and all the festivals he sets up and has for the last 40 plus years in the U.S. And then there's another trajectory, Ratha Bhushan, who built the chariots in Los Angeles and has built chariots for maybe a dozen other temples and has developed his own style of putting on the parade, has his own festival kit that he drives around and sets up parades all over the U.S. So there's two devotees who've made this their life's work in some ways. For Madhuha, it's truly his life's work. His whole year is spent preparing for this. For Ratha Bhushan Prabhu in Los Angeles, it's just one of the many services he does, but it's got to be at least a part-time job for the last 30 plus years. But there's also, in addition to our history over the last 50 years in the U.S., there's a history in Jagannath Puri, because our festival comes from Jagannath Puri. And so Jagannath Puri is located, or also known as Puri, is located on the eastern seaboard of India, kind of north mid country. So it's about 400 miles south of Calcutta. And it might be equivalent to Virginia Beach in terms of its location in India compared to an equivalent city in the U.S. And the main building that is the center of the city is the Jagannath Mandir. It's a temple for Krishna. And it's the heart of the city. The whole city was built around the temple. The temple is primarily a holy place, and the city was built around the temple. In fact, Main Street in Jagannath Puri is the Bada Danda. It's the great street, and its endpoint is the Jagannath Temple. So that's the big street in Jagannath Puri, Main Street, in the town of Jagannath Puri. The endpoint, we start our parade at the Civic Center, which is the heart of Santa Monica. The Jagannath Temple in Jagannath Puri is the heart of the city. And they also build chariots. Their chariots are, Jagannath's chariot is 44 feet tall, I guess, and 44 point something feet tall. And then Baladev's is a little smaller, and it's like 43 feet tall. And the Subhadra is a little smaller, it's 42 feet tall. But these are big chariots. They're over 4 stories tall. And they're built, over 1,000 logs are harvested from a forest that was given by a prince to Jagannath centuries ago in the forest of Odisha. Odisha is mainly a forest, agricultural, but also forest. Jharkhand is there as well, also forest. There's places in India which are quite not just unindustrialized, but unsettled. There are large tracts of, undeveloped forest. In fact, there's Adivasis. The indigenous people of India live in these forests and have forever. And they look ethnically distinct from the rest of the Indians, and they're their own group, like in the rainforest of Brazil. You also have these groups in India, the Adivasis. Actually, you have there's the Maldives, and attached to the Maldives, there's the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and there's the Sentinelese. And the Sentinelese are a group of indigenous peoples. They look black. That's what if you look at them, they will look like they're African. and they've been living in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands off in the Indian Ocean, off the coast, kind of off the coast from Calcutta, forever. And no one knows what their language is, and they're completely untouched by humanity. And if helicopters fly over, they shoot arrows at the helicopters. And if boats come, they shoot arrows at the boats. And every once in a while, this happened just in 2016, some American, Asian person, but from the U.S., he might have been Korean, but I think he was born in the U.S., he decided he wanted to go there and preach Christianity to them. So he got some waterproof Bibles, and he got a fisherman to illegally take him to the shore because it's illegal to actually go to North Sentinel Island. And he went on shore, and they killed him. There's a video of them killing him. They're not super violent, but they'll like talk to you a little bit and kind of laugh at you a little bit, but if you don't go away pretty quick, then they'll kill you. And then there was an extended negotiation where the Indian government tried to get the body back, but it refused to prosecute them for murder, because if somebody goes to their island, about 150 years ago, some British sailors kidnapped some people, and the parents, within a few days, died of sickness, and then they took the children back. And so, because these people had no contact with civilization, they're not immunized against, for instance, all of the coronaviruses. We had the Spanish flu, that was the original coronavirus of 1918, that killed, whatever it was, 3% of the world's population, some insane amount of people, maybe 50 million people. And then we have, 6 other coronaviruses, including COVID, which was the 7th coronavirus. We have all sorts of diseases like this that we, being born in the civilized world, we get exposed to them at a young age, and there's some kind of immunological response we have that was gifted to us by our parents. But when you get a civilization that's completely unexposed to these illnesses, then people will die, and you probably wipe out the whole population. And so you get this in India. It's, most Indian people who are born in India know this. These are the scheduled castes and tribes that are there for the system of reservations that exists in India, their version of affirmative action. But the most scheduled caste and tribe of all are the Adivasis. They're like the tribes in the rainforest of Brazil. So anyway, there's forests, and those forests were owned by princes hundreds of years ago, and they gifted the trees of those forests, and those trees are what's used to build the Ratha Yatra carts every year. And they don't use any modern machinery. The carts are completely constructed by hand using wood mallets. And even if they use some nails, those nails are made by blacksmiths according to traditional methods. Even Jagannath does not eat, for instance, tomatoes or chilies, because those things are not indigenous to India. It's funny, but Indian cooking, so much garlic, so much onion, so much chili, but these things are not native. These things were brought by outsiders. Just like there's like Hindutva and Jai Hind, but the word Hindu is a Persian word. It's not even an indigenous Sanskrit word. And so a lot of the cuisine we see is coming primarily from India, or even the clothing or some of the cultural mores, you can actually trace them back to the Middle East and Islam during that period of time when Islam ruled India. Some footprints are left from that. So in Jagannath Puri, the deities only eat indigenous vegetables made with indigenous spices. So tomatoes are out, chilies are out. You know this, Rupanugaji? You've heard this, right? Yeah. Similarly, the carts they build for the festival are only made from local forests by traditional implements, no brake system, no steering system, and everything fits together with a, what do you call it? But it's an old system of carpentry where things lock together. What is it? I mean, dovetail is a form of carpentry, but that's not what I'm thinking about. It's like a lock. What is it? Oh, they're just taking advantage of having a separate conversation. They heard us talking. They're like, okay, it's a free-for-all. It's like it's some system where you insert wood into another piece of wood, not in the same way you would, let's say, for just to nail things together, but there's a system where they can be moved. I can't remember what it's called, like a lock fit system or something like that. You can't remember? Anyway, that's the system they use. It's a very old method of construction. I mean, millennial old method of construction. Pre-industrialization method of construction. The chariots, these are 45-foot chariots, and the Odishan government has to come and certify them because they move on the road, and there's over 1 million people that come to the festival. If the chariots were to fall apart, it would be an absolute disaster. And there's no manual for how to make the chariots. It's passed down from father to son. And so it's, for hundreds of years, who knows for how long, it's been passed down. And they measure things by anguli, like it's 1 finger long, or 1 hatha long, one hand long. And the whole system is done by this old method of construction. And they make these huge ropes that are used to pull the chariots out of coconut fiber. And the chariots are built fresh every single year from scratch. They float the logs down the Mahanadi River. That's how they transport the logs. And then they carry them into Jagannath Puri. And there's, for about 60 days, 57 days to be specific, it starts on Akshaya Tritiya. And I believe they finish around Snan Yatra time. And so for about 57 days, they build these chariots every year. And it's a big chunk of these people's lives. And they do it voluntarily. And the chariots are made, according to some Shastric descriptions. They have to have 9 devatas on each side. And there has to be a charioteer. Like Arjuna is the charioteer of Subhadra's chariot, for example. And Garuda is the charioteer of Jagannath's chariot. And they build these chariots like to quite specific calculations. And then they have special canopies that they make using indigenous colors in the Odishan style. And so Jagannath's chariot is red and yellow. The yellow is because Krishna wears a yellow dhoti. And then Baladev's chariot is red and blue because Baladev wears a blue dhoti. And they have a specific color scheme. And everything's done the way it's been done for at least hundreds, if not thousands of years. And sometimes something new will happen. There was a king in the 15th century. He won a big battle, and so he gifted the deities a golden outfit. And so when the deity, made out of gold, like pounds of gold. And so when the deities return from the Ratha Yatra, they wear that Shunavesh, they wear that golden outfit for a day. And that was established in like 1460 whatever, and they've been doing that for the last 600 years. So there's a whole tradition. So just like we have a little mini tradition in America for our homage to the original festival in Puri, they have a multi-thousand-year tradition and trajectory. Like there's the Bhakta Salabega, who's a Muslim devotee of Jagannath, and so the Jagannath cart stops on the Danda, the Bada Danda. He'll stop at the Samadhi of this Bhakta Salabega. He was a Muslim devotee of Jagannath, maybe 5 centuries ago. And he was so devoted to Jagannath, even though he was a Muslim, that all the devotees decided, okay, he's a great devotee. And now the chariot will stop every year and give a darshan at that Muslim's Samadhi, where his body is interred. It might be where his ashes, he might have been burned. I don't know what they did with his body. There may be a Samadhi there, I'm not sure. But So they have these traditions, and their traditions, our traditions go back 50 years, their traditions will go back 500 years, or even thousands of years in some cases. And if you look, you'll see that there's a connection. The carpenters are honored, there's special rituals which are done. Like one of our rituals is that we have Mahaprasad, and then we throw the Mahaprasad off the chariot to people. And so that's not done in Puri, not to my knowledge. And so, but we have little packets of dried fruit and nuts which are offered to Jagannath, or lollipops, and then we throw them off the chariot, so everybody who sees the chariot gets a little bit of prasadam. Whether they know what's going on or not, there's like a lollipop or a little bit of dried fruit that they get. So Jagannath mercy has been given to everybody. So we have our little things that we've developed over time, and then the Puri festival has the original rituals. And so this huge festival takes place. Jagannath, each deity weighs, we don't know how much they weigh. We don't know how much they weigh, because no one will weigh them. It would be considered to be offensive. But there's maybe like 20 men that surround Jagannath, and they tie a post to his back. They tie a post to his back so that, because he can't touch the ground. So they, almost like Jesus and the crucifix, so they tie a post to his back. So the post hits the ground, but he doesn't hit the ground. And then they make these huge silk pillows, massive silk pillows. And they have to move the deity from the altar to the cart. And so they tie this big pillar to the deity and then have these silk ropes and this whole system, and a bunch of men come and they pick up the deity and they kind of swing it, and then when they get a good enough swing, they pick him up and move him from one pillow to the next. Subhadra's light, comparatively speaking. Maybe she weighs a few hundred pounds. So they just pick Subhadra up and carry her on their shoulders. So you see like 10 men carrying Subhadra on their shoulders. But Jagannath and Baladev are so big, it's impossible. And sometimes Mr. India, the bodybuilder for Mr. India, is from Puri. He's one of the Daityas from Puri who worships Jagannath. And so they're big guys. Big enough that the winner of the Mr. India bodybuilding competition is one of the Daityas, one of the servants of Jagannath who perform these services. So they're big guys. Usually they're fat and big. This one is muscular and big. But they, just 15, 20 men. They pick up the deity, they swing it, they pick it up, and then they drop it down on these huge pillows, and then the pillow goes whoosh, and all the stuffing in the pillow comes pouring out the sides. You can see it. And then they swing them again, and they pick them up, and it takes hours and hours for them to get from the temple to the chariot. And then they have to hoist the deity up on ropes. And it's a huge, there's well over 1 million pilgrims, and then there's hundreds and thousands of sevaks where their whole year is spent preparing for this. And we know about the pillow thing being old because the Chaitanya Charitamrita tells the same story about the deities being swung and picked up and moved. And you can see it happening now, but that book was written 412 years ago, and it tells the same story. You can read the book. It tells the story of the cushions making that sound as all the stuffing went out of them. And then you can look at videos of it happening now, and you can see the same thing being done now. And they get the deities up on these chariots, and then the devotees pull them, and they pull them about 3 kilometers to the Gundicha temple. And then the deity stays there for a week every year. So Jagannath leaves his big temple, he goes out on the main road, and he walks to the Gundicha temple. And that symbolizes Krishna returning to Vrindavan. That symbolizes Krishna returning to Vrindavan. It's probably gone out like 6 times, killing me. Not literally, figuratively. That symbolizes Krishna returning to Vrindavan. And so, just very briefly, we can note, before we close, that the meaning of the Ratha Yatra festival is perhaps more important than all of the details. But the details are quite astounding. 40-plus foot chariots, constructed from 1,000 logs, harvested naturally and flowed down the river the way they were transported for thousands of years, constructed by local artisans over a 2-month period in preparation for the festival every single year, using only indigenous materials and indigenous tools in a way that was passed down in a living oral tradition without ever being written down. Measuring things by one finger width or one hand width, as opposed to using some sort of system of measurement. And then those chariots are sound enough that they are certified by the Odishan government. And then the king of Puri comes out with a golden broom, and he becomes the bungi, the street sweeper for Jagannath, the king of Puri. Like they still have a monarchy in Puri. Obviously, the government is democratic, but they have, just like they have the king and queen of England, it's a largely titular role, but they live in a palace and so on and so forth. So there's a king of Puri, and the king of Puri comes out with a golden broom and walks in front of the Jagannath cart and sweeps the ground. And that job of being a street sweeper is like the lowest job. But the king shows his devotion to Jagannath by dressing humbly and sweeping the street in front of Jagannath to show that Jagannath is truly the king of Puri. So they have this, this beautiful system of ritual, and these details are important, and at least for me, they steal my heart. And I see our tradition in America and how we have our own traditions, but how they all have there's some kind of homage, there's some kind of they have some Puri-esque feel to them. They seem to be derivative of the original Jagannath tradition. And as the years go on, we even get closer and closer to approximating their festival. But more significant than those details is the meaning of the festival. And so the meaning of the festival is that one time during a solar eclipse, Krishna left Dwarka. And so Krishna's famous for leaving. All over, he's known as Ranchor in Gujarat. He's famous for running away from the battle and leaving and fleeing. There's even a temple dedicated to Krishna who does this. When he fought Jarasandha, he ran away over and over again, became famous. And so Krishna left Dwarka one time on the plea of the solar eclipse, and he went to Kurukshetra to perform a yagna. Solar eclipses are a big deal in ancient cultures, including in India, and people go to holy places and perform rituals. And so Krishna did that. And the devotees in Vrindavan heard that Krishna was coming close. Vrindavan is we could say about 100 miles southeast of Delhi. And you could say that Kurukshetra is about 100 miles northwest of Delhi. So there's, it's relatively close. Dwarka is hundreds and hundreds of miles away. But Kurukshetra is more than halfway, much more than halfway. It's quite close to Vrindavan. And so the devotees in Vrindavan heard that Krishna was returning to Kurukshetra. And so they all left Vrindavan to come and meet with Krishna. And they met Krishna in Vrindavan. They met Krishna in Kurukshetra. And he was on top of a big chariot. And when they saw Krishna on top of the chariot, they did not feel joy. They felt great sadness. Because atop that chariot, surrounded by an entourage, surrounded by so many devatas, and so many Gandharvas, and so many sadhus chanting prayers and glorifying Krishna as God, the Brijbasis, the residents of Vrindavan, Yashoda Mai, Nanda Baba, Radharani, everybody, Sridham, Sudama, they felt very sad. They felt very sad. And they felt sad because Krishna was so opulent and so godly that they could not dance with their friend, they could not play with their friend, they could not feed their friend. You have to remember, Yashoda loves Krishna so much, she ties him up. She chastises him for stealing butter. She has such intense love for Krishna, she forgets that he's God and thinks of him as just being her child. So when they saw Krishna looking so fancy, like God himself, they felt great sadness. Because in that mood, they could not play with Krishna. Yashoda, when she sees Krishna, milk will flow from her breasts. She's old enough to be a grandmother. Krishna's well grown up, but when she sees Krishna, immediately milk flows from her breast because she always thinks of Krishna as being her child. Practically, if she could, she would want to suckle Krishna to her chest. But she cannot. He's in this huge chariot. He's so opulent, so much Aishwarya, so much opulence. No madhurya, no sweetness. And so the Brijbasis get to Kurukshetra, and Krishna's on a huge chariot. And what do? They grab the ropes, and they start to drag Krishna away from all these devatas, away from all these sadhus, away from Kurukshetra, away from Dwarka, where he's worshipped as a king, and they try to drag Krishna back to Vrindavan. And so the Ratha Yatra festival is Krishna being pulled by his devotees from Vrindavan back to Vrindavan so that they can embrace and dance with and love Krishna in the intimate way that only they do. And Gundicha, the temple that Jagannath goes to for 7 days, is Vrindavan. It's Gupta Vrindavan. It's a hidden Vrindavan. There's gardens there at Gundicha. It's a very quiet, tranquil place, and so Jagannath goes there for 7 days. And so he leaves his opulent temple, where he's worshipped in grand style, to go to be with his intimate devotees who worship him very personally. And he does this every year. And in fact, when he gets back to Jagannath Puri, Lakshmi Devi comes out and she's very angry at him because he left. And he went and danced with the gopis, and he went and saw Radharani, and he left Lakshmi. Lakshmi is so opulent, and she's there in Puri, which is like Vaikunt, and Krishna left Vaikunt to go to Vrindavan, and when he comes back, there's some little negotiation, because Lakshmi's angry that Jagannath abandoned her, and he has to beg her favor, and then she lets him back, and then he's dressed in his royal garment, that golden garment, to signify that he's again returned to Vaikuntha and he's worshipped in this grand style again. But if you think about the whole city of Puri is designed with this grand road, and at one end you have Gundicha and the other end you have the Jagannath Mandir, and so at one end is Vaikuntha and at the other end is Vrindavan, and the whole festival of Puri, the whole year of Jagannath's festivals, is fulfilled when Krishna finally leaves Vaikuntha to go back to Vrindavan to be with his dear devotees. And that is Puri, and that is Ratha Yatra, and that is our tradition as well, and that's what's being replicated with all the ritual, this symbolic idea. So that festival just happened. I think we have 50,000 people that come through the festival up in Los Angeles, and we serve usually over 20,000 plates of prasad. Our temple there makes 20,000 plates of prasad, and not every person who walks past and comes in will eat, but we serve over 20,000 plates of prasad to over 50,000 visitors to that festival. And it takes place just in the heart of Venice at the Venice Boardwalk. So if you didn't go, go next year. It's always the first Sunday in August. The first Sunday in August. And our Ratha Yatra is always 1 week before, the Sunday before the first Sunday in August. And so and then San Francisco is 1 week after the first Sunday in August. So Laguna Beach, Los Angeles, San Francisco, 3 Ratha Yatras on 3 Sundays. And that's our tradition here. The Puri Ratha Yatra takes place on Shukla Dvitiya in the month of Ashad. So there's the month of June, July. That's the month of Ashad. And then the second day of the bright moon. So when the moon is growing, when it's waxing, that second day, Dvitiya, on that day is Ratha Yatra. Usually happens end of June, beginning of July, and then our festival takes place end of July, beginning of August. We don't try to compete with Puri. We let them have their day and then we follow. And our Ratha Yatras are before, like New York is before, Los Angeles is after, and then after San Francisco is Vancouver, and like this. And we also have in Seattle, all up and down the coast, and then they're traveling here and there. Chicago, Washington, D.C., everywhere. They go everywhere. Detroit, everywhere. So thank you very much for coming. We'll do a little kirtan now. Hare Krishna.